The veteran's name is Earl Herndon. They were born on October 18, 1934. He served in the Army during the Cold War. He achieved the rank of colonel. We are recording this on February 18, 2013. I am Daniel Mack. In the room with me is Heidi Gersmeyer and Nicole Palmietta, of no relation. So, Colonel, would you tell me about your childhood and growing up? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Fountain Inn, South Carolina, about 55 miles from here, Greenville County.
And being born in 1934, that would have been the height of the Great Depression?
I'm sorry?
Being born in 1934, that would have been the height of the Great Depression?
Yes, it was toward the end of it, but certainly during the Depression. I didn't know much of anything about it. My dad had graduated from Furman in 1932, and I know he had a tough time getting a job in 32, so there was still impacts of the Depression.
When you graduated high school, what did you decide to do?
During high school, I decided that I wanted to study engineering. My dad was a public school teacher and had graduated from Furman University, and my mom had gone to Winthrop and had nurses training, and I knew I didn't want either one of those professions, so I decided I wanted to be an engineer, and I thought the best place to come in South Carolina was Clemson for that education. So I started in 1952 at Clemson in civil engineering.
Tell me about your time there.
Well, Clemson in 1952 was, if I remember the numbers correctly, around 2,500, maybe 3,000 students during the 1952 to 56 time frame when I was here. It was all male, all military, and the curriculum at that time were about 1/3 engineering, 1/3 textile, and about 1/3 in the various agricultural majors. The military changed during my sophomore, junior year, 54, 55, dropped ROTC as mandatory and still had a 2-year commitment at that time. And so I took the 2 years and decided in 1953 that I wanted to join the reserves, so I joined a local reserve unit here in Clemson, an infantry unit, my sophomore year, 1953. The second big change that occurred during that time frame was the admission of the co-eds, and that was a very popular among the all-male population students at that time, and there were many surveys in the Tiger about, do you really think we ought to do this? And a lot of discussion about dropping the ROTC. Should we allow fraternities and sororities? And those were sort of the hot ticket issues during the 50s. Johnston Hall was built during that time, and I, of course, my senior year lived in Johnston Hall. It was a transition time, and but I think as students we appreciated. And of course, I was not interested in the military at that time, and certainly had no intention of making it a career. By joining the reserves, though, I had 3 summer camps at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, through the reserves, and when I graduated in 1956, I decided I wanted to go into environmental engineering. Clemson at that time did not have an environmental engineering program, so I came back for a year of postgraduate work and took courses that were available in different schools related to environmental engineering, and so I didn't go in the Army until 1957. And was commissioned in the Medical Service Corps in 1957 as an environmental engineer. First assignment was in Munich, Germany. Well, after schooling at Texas, in San Antonio, Texas, the basic AMED medical department course. And then was assigned to Germany, in Munich, Germany, as my first assignment. So that takes you up through college and through that first year in the military.
And I understand you have some pictures you took while you were in Germany.
Yes, I had one assignment in Munich, 1957 to 1960, and then later, 1967 to 1971 in Frankfurt, Germany. And I had many opportunities to travel, and I have quite a few pictures there. I do have a I had some pictures which I have not been able to find while stationed in Korea, of the demilitarized zone in Korea. And I do have, but most of my slides were from Germany, yes.
And we have what you've managed to get digitized right here, so if you wouldn't mind going through them with me. Tell me about this one.
Okay, one of my jobs in the when I was stationed in Munich was to go out to a series of border camps that the U.S. Army operated on the Czechoslovakian, East German, West German border. And this is one of the small communities of Eisenstein on the Czechoslovakian West German border. And the actual country boundary ran right through the train station. That picture is inside, of course, in Western Germany, and you're looking over into Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and they dug the Russians, or the East Germans, I'm not sure which, dug up the train tracks, and that's on one side of the station. There are some other slides that will show the other side and the road that was dug up that went in front of the train station in that little community. This is on the opposite side from the other one, and you can see the Landgrenze is a country boundary. The actual Czechoslovakian West German border is right there at that sign, and in the middle of that picture is in the distance is a tower. It's about 1,000 yards from the actual border into Czechoslovakia, and that's a border camp patrol. And with binoculars, you could see two soldiers on that tower. In between that border and those towers, and right at the towers, were three fences that were about 20 to 30 feet apart. I would say 12 to 15 feet high with barbed wire on top. And that whole area was mined to stop the Czechoslovakians or East Germans or anybody from the eastern countries coming into West Germany. This is a picture of Len DeWitt and his son, and my wife is in the yellow dress, and our son and the DeWitt's daughter. Len DeWitt was in the Oregon National Guard and deployed during World War II, and during the combat operations he fought throughout the Pacific with the Oregon National Guard and was recommended for a Medal of Honor. He received the Legion of Merit for that combat, and the Oregon, he's now in his 90s, but we were stationed together with them in Munich as well as at Fort Meade, Maryland, and this is in the Washington, D.C. Airport when we were stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland, in the Washington area.
Do you know, do you know the details of the specific instance he was recommended it for?
I have read the citation, and his company was pinned down, and he was a sergeant at that time in the Oregon National Guard, and the Japanese overran their area, and he single-handedly fought off a whole slew, I think a company or more, and kept for several hours until he ran out of ammunition, and actually in essence saved the company from being annihilated in that jungle. This is back to this is from the border camp itself. Was about 10 kilometers inside from the Czechoslovakian German border, and the border camp was armored cavalry units from the U.S. Army were rotated, and they patrolled the border in the operations room, which we'll see later on a slide. They had the landscape depicted, and so any soldier could go in there and look at that landscape, buildings, trees, houses, any distinguishing landmarks, and you could look at that, and then you could go out actually on patrol in that area, and you could tell whether there had been any changes or not. If there were any, of course this was one of the traditional invasion routes from Europe, East Germany, I mean the Russians, had they attacked, this is one of the areas they would have come through. And if there were any troop builds up, you could see that happening on the other side. So that's a view looking toward Czechoslovakia.
While you were stationed there, was there ever any instance where there was, I guess, a bit of showing off by the Russians, where they did build up on that border, or any other one?
No, no, there was never a build-up in this area, or as far as I know, other areas too. There were harassments, and they did have patrols that went back and forth both ways, gathering intelligence, but no troop build-ups for an invasion. That's another view that shows the countryside. It's a rural area. The border just literally split that little town, and there were brothers and sisters and cousins and family members, where one would be in Czechoslovakia and one would be over in West Germany, and they were not allowed any contact at that time. They could, I'm told that they could wave and they could send messages back and forth, but they wouldn't cross that area. This area out in here was a mined area, so you didn't go by the Russians or the East Germans, and so nobody ventured out into those areas except in the wintertime when it was frozen over. And there were people that did escape through this route too. Another shot of the railroad station. This actually shows the railroad tracks coming in and were dug up on the Czechoslovakian border. There were no trains, of course. This was not one of the pass points that the Russians allowed travel back and forth into Eastern Europe, into the Iron Curtain. But that just shows the fence at the border and then the tracks that were dug up. That's a good shot. It shows the Czechoslovakian sign, and my big boss from Heidelberg, and my immediate boss, and another officer that I worked with, as we went inside that waiting room. And inside the waiting room, the fence went all the way from the floor to the ceiling. And of course there were no people, there was no traffic, no trains coming through there, so there was no activity going on in that area.
So there was a building with a fence through the middle of it? That's
correct, right in the waiting room. It's just a typical small town train station like you'd see here, and like we had in Fountain Inn at one time. And in the waiting room area, this fence went all the way from the floor to the ceiling.
They couldn't board up any doors, or they had to put a fence.
Well, it was just an open area. It was a big waiting area, and they had benches and seats like you'd have in a waiting area in a train station.
Well, was there a purpose to the waiting area during the Cold War, or?
No, it wasn't used for anything. It was not used at all.
Well, I'm sure when the fence was taken down, they appreciated it not taking out the.
Well, when the Iron Curtain fell, that of course these disappeared, and of course Germany was East and West. I keep referring to East and West Germany, and the distinction doesn't exist today, fortunately. That's a better view if you can see the details. I tried to get the fence, those three fences that are shown out in there somewhere, and the fences were, I'm told they were electrified, and they had those towers that you saw one of were visible from one tower to the next, so they had a constant surveillance of the border. Anybody trying to get across that area, they could see from one tower to the next. And that's another shot without the name of the country border that shows the tower, the guard tower in the middle. And we were told that these were East German soldiers, Army soldiers, East German soldiers, not Soviets at that time. This would have been in the 1957 to 1960 time frame. This is a training area at Grafenwehr. Grafenwehr was the tank training for the German Panzer, their tank training area before and during and after World War I. And that's actually a water tower at Grafenwehr, the training area. The training areas were all around. The Army still operates as a training area. And it's near the Czechoslovakian East German border, not too far from there. This is a shot of Soldiers Field in Nuremberg. Hitler's grand scheme was to make Nuremberg a world headquarters once he conquered the world. And they had this built for parades, and Hitler would stand on the stand, and great big swastika. I've seen those in newsreels. Of course, all those were removed, but Soldiers Field was also ringed by a wall, and we'll see pictures of that later. And he had towers that were going to be the tombs for Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin after he conquered the world and defeated the Western forces. This is the courtroom in Nuremberg where the Nuremberg war trials were held. That's my mother and father and my wife that were there visiting. This building was called the Palace of Justice. It was a German legal place before and after the war, and after we captured it, and at the end of World War II, it was used for the trial of the Russians, of the Germans, in this room. And I have seen many movies of that. There's an interesting story at Goring. They would file them in, and they would sit in those boxes where my parents and my wife were sitting. And they were kept in a jail in a building next door. And one of the Russian judges, during one of the proceedings, or prior to one of the proceedings, pulled out a pistol and shot at Goring, and he ducked, and it went into the back of the seat. And I actually saw that slug was still in the back of the seat.
Was the chair like protected or preserved, or?
That's just, it was, well, in the 60s it was still there. This building has been released to the Germans now. We use it for the headquarters for the European exchange system.
Could you sit in the chair if you wanted to?
It was a bench. It was like, just envision a church bench, big oak benches, and they sat in those benches. Yeah, you could sit. I didn't actually sit in it, but the person this was not on tour. I had access to this area because I was inspecting the water system that provided the water into this building.
So this would have been this is definitely in East Berlin.
No, this is in Nuremberg, in Nuremberg, which was in West Germany. This is in Nuremberg, right? The Palace of the Nuremberg War Trials. It's a very interesting book. While I was stationed in Munich, I read the entire proceedings of the Nuremberg War Trials, and it's a book about yay thick. But it was an interesting, of course, English translation of those proceedings of the Nuremberg War Trials.
How many Americans did have access to any type of border crossing, or?
There were the authorized crossings were, there was an Autobahn that ran into Berlin, the main highway, and you could drive with the orders if you military could drive your private owned vehicles. Additionally, from Frankfurt, as a part of the agreement between the powers at Potsdam at the end of the war, there was a train that left Frankfurt every night, a U.S. military train that went to Berlin. It was pulled by a West German engine to the East German border, and then an East German engine took it over and carried it on to Berlin. It was an all-night trip, but that's the only way you had access. There were also a couple of areas that the Western Allies could fly in. There was a flight card. There were about 2 or 3 of them, and I've made that trip too in the military aircraft into Berlin.
Was there anti-air waiting if anybody got out of that corridor, or?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm not aware of any anti-aircraft if you got out of the corridor.
Good thing we never found out.
No. That's on the back side of the building in Nuremberg, where that courtroom is located. These were the jail cells where Goring and the rest of the Nazi parties that were captured were held, and then they were brought from those jail cells into the room for the actual trial. This is a monument that the West Berliners put up during the Russians blocked the highway going in and the train route going in at some point in time. I don't remember when that occurred. But there was the Berlin Airlift, and so the U.S. forces, primarily with C-24s, supplied coal and food and everything that was in West Berlin and flew it into Tempelhof Air Force Base. That's the air base in the background of the building, and this is a monument that the Berliners put up to honor that airlift. And that happened, that was on for several months. Everything that went, all the supplies that sustained Berlin for a period of time were flown into Tempelhof Air Base. This is one of the few places the Army had a tour. We could go into East Berlin, and outside East Berlin there was a Russian memorial park that the Russians had established, and that's a statue that as they captured Berlin, that was a statue in that memorial park for the Russian soldiers. And there's another picture later probably of that. Yes, this is another shot showing that memorial park. You'll note the quality of the pictures. This was in the wintertime, and this was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I've had to try to enhance that as best I could, but the pictures are not high quality. But that's a part of the Russian memorial that was outside Berlin, on the eastern side. This is East Berlin. The Russians and the East Germans only cleared up one street, and the buildings, they were only one building wide, and between the buildings you could see the rubble still in the background. Again, this was in 1958 or 1959. But that was taken from a bus. We were on a bus tour.
So there was pretty much, was it all Americans on the tour bus?
Yes. This was a U.S. Army sponsored tour.
And the Russians didn't think anybody would notice the buildings behind?
That was allowed. That was allowed. That one bus could go in there, I think, 4 or 5 days a week and take this tour. The only place we could get out of the bus was at that Russian memorial. We could get out there and wander around. But I was trying to take a picture here showing the street in East Berlin, where Berlin, at this time, West Berlin was thriving. They'd cleaned up. There were still empty areas where the damage had been done, but it had been rebuilt. There are several shots that are fuzzy. There's another one. That one's trying to show through the buildings how the buildings were only one building wide, and then there was nothing but rubble behind there. It had not been rebuilt by the East Germans or the Russians. And another shot. I was trying to show that area between the buildings with the rubble in the background. And just one. It was, I would say, it was about 7 or 8 blocks long and one building wide. This is getting close. This is close to the bunker where Hitler committed suicide as the Russians were capturing Berlin. And there'll be another one that shows, very fuzzy, but it shows the rubble. When I was there, the only thing left of that bunker was rubble. And of course, we didn't get out. This is it. That's the rubble where Hitler had.
Were you not allowed outside the bus at all?
The only place we could get out was at that Russian memorial. Right.
Just the Russian memorial.
We just drove through. And of course, there's no traffic. There were no cars, no private cars or taxis or nothing in East Berlin.
Fully communist society?
West Berlin was a thriving city, with streetcars and taxis and private cars all over, but not in East Berlin at that time.
But East Berlin would have been communist rule, completely communist.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. That was a part of the Iron Curtain that Russia controlled, along with all the other countries in Eastern Europe. That's another view of the towers in Nuremberg, where Hitler was going to establish his world headquarters and have the leaders of the free country were going to be buried in those.
I don't suppose you know which one was which.
I don't know. No, I don't know. They weren't labeled. They weren't, and I don't know which one was which.
Well, you think it might be?
But one was for Roosevelt, one for Churchill, and one for Stalin. 3 of them. There are actually 4, but there are 3 of them. I really don't know what the 4th one was for.
It was for the Japanese. Just didn't want to tell anybody.
Well, I'm not sure. They were allies at that time. So That's a view from atop one of the walls looking toward those towers. And that's the Soldiers Field. This is where they had the Nazis party, had their big parades and demonstrations. And this is the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, and inside that building is where the courtroom was, where the Nuremberg war trials were held, and on the back side of that building was the jail where they held the prisoners. This was used at that time by the Army, the U.S. Army, as a European exchange system headquarters. It was a headquarters, but that area where the courtroom was blocked off, the Army just protected it. Did not utilize it at that time. I don't know what's happened to that today.
What rank were you when you were in Germany?
In Munich, I was a first lieutenant and promoted to first lieutenant. And then when I was in Frankfurt, I was a major and a promotable lieutenant colonel. This is one of the operations building at the border camps that I described earlier. And inside that building was that mural of the landscape that you would be looking at. Showed the border and the fences and any buildings or churches or structures, so that you could tell if anything had changed from one day to the next. That was, to me, was a descriptive sign. There was an armored cavalry. They rotated. There was an armored cavalry unit, and the sign is the furthest outpost of democracy. And in fact, it actually was in this part of the world, anyway.
Farthest east of any of the checkpoints?
There were several of these border camps. I had about 4 of them that were in the southern part of Germany that was in the area where I worked when I was in Munich. And I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, of all the border camps, was it the closest to Russia?
Yes. Well, and they were on the East German or Czechoslovakian border. Yes, in the areas that the U.S. had forces in. That's a lake that was near that border camp. Of course, would freeze over in the wintertime, but it just shows the terrain. The military tankers always liked that. This was great tank country, they claimed. Except in the wintertime when you bogged down, or in the summer and spring when you bogged in the mud. Well, that's our son and DeWitt's son, and when we were stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. I had taken some pictures of, just to show the different places that we lived on post, and that's all that one depicts. That's Fort Meade, Maryland. We're outside the Washington, D.C. area. And this is back to the border camp, was a flagpole and that operations building in the background. And the armored cavalry units would have, 5 or 6 tanks and armored personnel carriers there, but they rotated. They would spend about 6 weeks out there, and they'd go back to their home base for about 6 weeks. Then they would go to Grafenfeld, Hohenfels, or Vilseck, the 3 training areas.
Well, why the 6-week rotation? Why on 6 weeks?
It was considered a very unpleasant duty, and so they wouldn't station anybody out there permanently. And the conditions were very austere. And no families, of course. There were no dependents allowed at the border camps. And the flagpole and looking in the background, but this is about 10 kilometers from the Czechoslovakian border. A close-up of one of the towers in Nuremberg at Soldiers Field. Must be the end of them, huh? Yeah, that's back to
looks like. So those are all the slides that we had.
Right. I have other slides, and I lost them. My computer died, as you know, and I lost them. But I think I've gotten some help, and I'm temporary, so I'm gonna go back and these are 2x2 slides that I scanned in to the computer.
Now I've written down some questions during about how were refugees treated that managed to make it across.
They were welcome, and of course it changed over time. And when the war ended in '45, they were just thousands of them. They had no fence and no border, and they weren't stopping them at that time. And the refugees were treated with open arms by the U.S. forces, as well as the German and French and Belgian. A lot from Czechoslovakia came into West Germany and Poland. I had a German engineer that worked for me that was originally from a town that wound up in East Germany, and he was a pilot and was shot down in the Battle of London in 1940 and spent from 1940 to 45 in a POW camp in Canada, and learned his English and studied engineering. And Carl, when he got back in '47 to East Germany, he was going to restart his construction company his dad had, and he and his sister were the only ones that survived in his family. He determined very early the Russians were not going to allow any free enterprise, so he got out at the time when you could cross over by just walking or take a train out. And he's had family in Munich and moved to Munich. But the refugees, they were, as far as I know, they were treated with welcome arms, and the Russians gradually clamped down the border to the point where even later they built the wall there in Berlin. And I visited Berlin both before the wall went up and several times after the wall was up.
How fast was, I guess, East Germany rebuilt? Or how was, not, I guess, where you wouldn't have been over there then, but were there, while you were over there, were there a lot of people who were thinking the wall might going to be up for the rest of their lives? Or
at that time, when I moved from Frankfurt, Germany to Washington D.C. area to the Army Surgeon General's office in 1971, and at that time it looked like it'd go forever. And I think you are familiar with Mr. President Reagan's admonition to take this wall down. And then there was the unrest in Poland that I think, but the decline of the Soviet Union took a long period of time, and it didn't happen overnight. But at that time, there was no reason to believe it wouldn't go on for a long, long time. But the condition of East Germany was terrible. When they became a combined country, that was one of the downsides for the West Germans. They had to then help what had been East Germany rebuild and come up into the current century.
When you were on your tours, did you see any East Germans, or?
Yes, I walked into Berlin. The military in uniform could walk in through Checkpoint Charlie, and I have some slides of Checkpoint Charlie that I haven't found yet, but they were East German guards at the border, and I walked in past the guards and walked into East Berlin. One of the best museums in Berlin was wound up in East Berlin, so I walked in and I'd go into that Berlin and then go into a restaurant and have lunch, and with the rate of exchange for the money, things were very cheap at that time. So, and I saw the East German. I'm not aware. They did have at the Brandenburg Gate there were some Soviet soldiers in Berlin, but they were not visible. In fact, our guidance when we walked in through Checkpoint Charlie was, if they started harassing us, which they had done in the past, then to ask for a Russian officer, because as far as the U.S. was concerned, the Russians were in charge. And these were East German soldiers that you actually saw and walked shoulder to shoulder with machine guns over there. Very stern, all of them very tall. They were at least over 6'2", and they wouldn't make eye contact with you, and no smiles at all. And they were always in pairs. And when I walked in, one would get on one side and one on the other, and almost elbow to elbow, walked for about a block until I got into East Berlin, and then they would peel off and go back to their station.
How tense were relations while you were over there? Was it worse, or did it ever escalate and then decrease down, or?
Yeah, It was very tense at all times. We had, there was always, especially in the 50s, we were stationed in Munich. We were only, well, down the Autobahn, a tank could make it from Czechoslovakia to where we were in probably 3 or 4 hours. So had they decided, the Russians decided to attack in that area. And we had alerts every month, usually in the middle of the night, and you had to have 80% or a certain percentage of your unit ready to go and on the job within 30 minutes, and then a certain number within 2 hours.
Was there ever a day or a moment where you were like, this is going to be it, or this is the worst one? Or
No, I guess the first time when I thought there was a motor pool about 2 miles from our house, and the first alert we had at 3 o'clock in the morning, the first thing the military would do is go in and crank up all these tanks and APCs and big trucks. And I woke up and I heard all these vehicles running, and they were warming them up. And I thought this was it, but this was just an alert that was occurring.
Well, how long did it take you to figure that out?
About 30 minutes before I realized it. No, it was tense, and the same thing in Korea at the DMZ. Those Quonset huts and the North Korean soldiers that were guards, and our MPs were handpicked to be in that area, and they would get elbow to elbow and nudge you with their elbows, try to provoke something. And of course, we were instructed and were warned that this might happen and what to do in case it did. You asked for, in that case, you asked for an officer. You wanted to talk to an officer.
Before we get into Korea fully, I remember you said something about a lawsuit that involved you, that you had to testify in a lawsuit in Germany.
Yes. We had a situation, this is when I was stationed in Frankfurt with the Engineering Command, where at one of our training areas, Hohenfels, there was a kill of fish, trout were killed, and maybe have to digress a little, explain in Germany the property, the landowner owned the animals, and if there was a fish stream there and you wanted to fish for trout, you had to get permission, of course, and have a license and take a training course and go trout fishing. And if you caught any fish, then the property owner owned the fish. You had to buy them then if you wanted to keep them. So we had in one of our training areas, there was a fish kill in a trout stream, and it was alleged that it came from our chlorine that we were putting in the drinking water and then discharging into the stream. And we had evidence that was not the case. And it was every spring there would be a lot of snow on the ground in that area, and when you start having rain, there'd be a snow melt and a runoff, and it was the runoff from that snow melt and from the sediment that was washing into the stream that killed the trout, and the oxygen level would drop. And we were able to prove that, but I had to go to Regensburg into a state court and testify that what we had done, what precautions we had taken. We had a waterborne food poisoning, an outbreak of gastroenteritis at that place, and it was because of sewage that was getting in the water, and we instigated some procedures to prevent that. And one of the methods was increasing the chlorine, but we could prove it, and we were able to. And the case was dismissed.
And can you explain specifically your job again, your title, and?
Okay. Well, at that time I was just an environmental engineer at the staff level. In Frankfurt with Engineer Command, I was in charge of the sanitation branch with the Engineer Command, and the sanitation branch had the water and wastewater treatment, solid waste, and sewage disposal, and pollution control. We had went to great efforts to try to make sure we didn't violate the air pollution or water pollution laws of Germany to protect both the Germans and the U.S. When in the Washington, D.C. area, I was the environmental pollution consultant to the Army Surgeon General. I've skipped several assignments here, but one of the things we did, and starting in 1971, the federal government, under the National Environmental Policy Act, was required to write environmental impact statements for any money, federal-funded construction projects over a certain amount. At that time, it was $25,000, and you couldn't build anything for that. We had to do a study that studied the impact on the environment. And for the Army Surgeon General's office, these were all for health protection, and I reviewed all of those environmental impact statements that was done. Some very interesting cases that we had, and we had to consider the environment in the planning process for those various projects, which was a change. The military prior to then just usually did what they wanted to and were not subject to the local laws. But after 1971, we were. You're about to run out of time.
No, sir, no, just making sure everything's still working.
Okay.
Make sure the audio didn't cut off all of a sudden. Before we move on to Korea, one quick question. What would you say while you were in Germany, how strict would you compare the German laws of the environmental protection laws as America in the same time period?
Same time frame. Yes, that's a very good question. And we were very concerned about that. The Germans had a different philosophy in their water pollution laws. Their philosophy was to protect the source, and most of their drinking water sources were wells, and so they would have certain restrictions on what you could do within a certain number of meters of the wells. In the United States, surface water, streams, rivers, creeks, and as they became polluted as the country was developed, we had to have treatment and of those sources. So there was a difference there. In the air pollution area, they were a little behind us in the 50s and the 70s when I was stationed in Germany in the air pollution laws. They had kind of an interesting philosophy at one time where if you had a pollutant that was going up a smokestack, you just raise the stack higher. And of course all that did was throw it further downstream in the air column. But they had some very stringent laws, particularly around these well. For example, oil was a constant problem with the track vehicles carried gallons of oil, and if you broke a transmission or spill that, well, you had a huge oil slick that could get in the waterway. But I would say they were comparable or more strict than what the U.S. rules were in the 60s and 70s, well, especially in the 50s.
Now, moving on to Korea, when were you first stationed there?
1964 to 1965. It was a one-year assignment, unaccompanied, without the family, of course.
And what rank?
I was a captain at that time. And in the Army, 8th Army Surgeon's Office, and my job there was to protect. We had in the thousands of military stationed in Korea, and the water supplies were inadequate in the sense that they were field water systems, and providing cholera and other waterborne diseases, typhoid, were prevalent in the civilian population, and the challenge there was to protect the military, the U.S. forces that were stationed there.
Now, when you were there, can you compare, I guess, a lot of aspects to Germany in the sense that how many refugees were there? A lot less refugees getting across in Korea.
Oh, there were none. The North Koreans didn't know. They had the border sealed off at the 38th parallel, and there were none that were coming. Now, during the Korean War, of course, that's not the case. They were refugees during the war, 50 to 53. Backing up to my early days at Clemson, when I came to Clemson in 1952, the Korean War was still going.
What was the atmosphere? I guess the difference between Germany and Korea. How tense was it? Was it more tense in a sense?
It was, depending on how far you were from the demilitarized zone. The 38th parallel was the border between North and South Korea. And along that it was very tense. In fact, there were patrols all the time going back and forth both ways. And it was mine, and that was in fact, we lost anywhere from 6 to 15 U.S. soldiers killed in that demilitarized zone every year, mostly from landmines. There were fields. All that area was landmine. I would say about a 10-kilometer stretch along the 38th parallel.
And most of them would still be there today.
I don't know about today. I can't answer it. I would assume it's still the same. They're still tunneling, and they still catch the North Koreans trying to tunnel under the DMZ.
Did you ever hear of any getting catch trying to tunnel under while you were there?
No. Tried to walk across, yes, but not tunnel under.
How would you compare, I guess, the personnel stationed there between Germany and Korea? You said they were very top-notch, I believe, a minute ago.
They were top-notch, and they were the MPs that were I was talking about that were at the border camps, and the MPs on Checkpoint Charlie. They were all handpicked, and they were all over 6 feet tall. Both Americans and the East Germans, same way. Same thing in Korea, along the DMZ. We commonly think of the Koreans as being maybe a shorter stature, Asians in general, but these MPs from North Korea were all 6'2" or higher. They were huge individuals, and they were handpicked to be their military police too.
Did you spend a lot of time within sight of the demilitarized zone when you were?
Not a lot of time. Seoul, it was only about 30, 40 kilometers away from Seoul. I was stationed in the 8th Army headquarters in Seoul, the capital of South Korea. And we had I spent a lot of time at the military camps that were in that area, supporting and guarding the DMZ. We had a number of troops up there, and I spent a lot of time there, within sight of the DMZ.
Do you know anyone with their own story that you overheard about, or that somebody told you about Korea? Especially a unique story from being on the border, or?
About the only ones I can. It was also excellent pheasant and duck hunting in that area, and we had a lot of soldiers occasionally that would get up in that area to go duck or pheasant hunting and get out in these areas where they had been mined and get in trouble. But no really personal, interest type stories that I'm aware of.
And you said earlier there was instances when there was shoulder to shoulder standing with other.
These are the at the Checkpoint Charlie, the East German. They would be shoulder to shoulder, and when you walk in as an individual in uniform, one would get on one side of you and one on the other.
That was in East Germany.
That was at Checkpoint Charlie in East Germany. That's correct. After you walked in from West Berlin into East Berlin.
What about the checkpoints in Korea? Or were there even any checkpoints at all?
No.
Zero?
No. Panmunjom, where the peace treaties were held, or talks were held, there was a regular camp there. There were
ceasefire
temporary, right, but there were no tourists. You had to ride in a military vehicle to get up to those, and there was no crossing at all.
Were there ever any alerts like you experienced in Germany?
Oh yeah, we were pretty much on 24-hour alert in Korea.
Same question as before. Were there any nights that were particularly standout?
There were some tense times when you would get rumblings that things were going to happen, and usually there were rumors, or there would be maneuvers. They would have maneuvers on both sides. We had maneuvers, as did the North Koreans. Most of those were out, though not in the Seoul area. They were out more in the mountains area of North-South Korea.
How good was the intelligence or the rumors of how it was across the fence? Of course, today we know that there's a lot of human rights violations.
Right.
But compared to Germany, where we could eventually have people going back and forth, how good was the intelligence, or how what was the state that you knew of across the fence?
Yeah, the only way I can answer that is I don't know anything specific. First of all. Secondly, there was nobody trying to get into East Europe. They were all trying to get out. So that tells you, hey, there's something there on the western side, that we want out. And
you mentioned we could at least sneak across to Germany.
The German, Karl Rasloff, there's a German that worked for me, had been a pilot for the German, drafted an enlisted pilot, shot down over London in 1940 before the U.S. ever got into the war. Carl, told me right away. He went back and he had then become East Germany and realized the Russians weren't going to allow any free enterprise. They were tightening up on individual companies and individual entrepreneurship. So that just wasn't going to happen under the Soviet system.
In both places, did you ever put any policies or programs as an environmental engineer that were long-withstanding, that were there years after you left?
Probably the most unique one I did was when I was in the Chief Engineer's office, the Army Environmental Office in the Pentagon. We were getting, this was in the 70s time frame. We were becoming more and more concerned about encroachment. Here in the United States, civilian communities were growing up around the military bases, and there were more and more complaints about the noise that was being generated, primarily from training areas. And I was instrumental in working with a group of folks and following the Air Force lead, really, that created an air compatibility zone around a military base. And we'd go out under this regulation. We wound up as a regulation 200-1, Army Regulation 200-1. I got that through, and what we would do would be negotiate with the local people around the training areas, and we would have, in essence, buy easements that would allow us to continue our training, and not allow the bases to be closed down because of encroachment.
Was there anybody that you maybe would not want to name that said, well, they're the ones building houses near the military base and let them do it?
Absolutely. All the commanders said that. Absolutely. And this cost the Army money to go out and get those easements, but we felt like it was cost effective in the long run rather than having to shut down. I can tell you there were training areas around Fort Belvoir, Virginia, or there in the suburbs suburbs of D.C. in Virginia. It was the Engineer Training Center, and they taught demolition, how to blow up bridges and railroads, and they had to stop and move that. They had to move it to another state because of encroachment and complaints about training that was going 24/7.
And your job, what rank were you when you were at the Pentagon?
I was a colonel.
That's when you were a colonel?
I was a colonel, yes.
Going back to Korea right quick, was their infrastructure less developed than West Germany when you were in Korea? Were there any programs that you might have done there that they might need more?
Yes and no. It was very primitive in terms of their water treatment and wastewater treatment and solid waste disposal, almost non-existent. They just didn't have treatment. In fact, they were still using human waste to fertilize rice paddies, for example, and that creates all kinds of environmental problems. So we would cooperate with the Korean health authorities and try to show them, especially around the bases where we had military assigned, that these practices were detrimental to not only their own health but to the U.S. forces that were there too. But we really had no control or even tried to influence, what they did. But it was primitive compared to West Germany and West German standards.
So I guess I've grown up in a world where we're very active in the local governments of places we have Army bases and we set them up. So in both cases you would say, even though we were relatively recently had set up Army bases there, we're not really working with the governments that were already there for the countries. Our bases were just kind of there, and we made sure we didn't interfere. Is that correct?
That's overseas, and here in this country, the federal properties were, for a time, up until 1971, specifically with the Environmental Policy Act, but the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Acts, the federal installations were considered federal property and did not come under the jurisdiction of the state or county. Those all changed with the various congressional acts, and the federal agencies had to comply with the substantive parts of those acts. We didn't necessarily have to fill out all the forms, and we'd take that a city or a state or a county might impose, but we had to provide all the information. how much air pollution we were putting out, what we coal-fired boilers, for example, and then what we were doing to try to correct those situations. So those acts in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the congressional acts. The converse of that is when the Army, the military, either service, any of the branch, identified an environmental pollution problem that was not meeting the standards here in the United States, and we documented that, and we developed a project. The Congress never, to my knowledge, ever turned us down those funds. We got the funds to build the sewage treatment plants and the wastewater treatment plants and the solid waste treatment plant facilities in order to comply with the federal acts. Now we had to have all the T's crossed and the I's dotted and fill out the paperwork right. We got turned down because for administrative reasons, but not once we documented a problem, the Congress then funded us. And there were 4 committees that we worked with when I was in the chief engineer's office, 2 in the House and 2 in the Senate, one on the appropriations side and one on the, there were 2 groups anyway, 2 different committees in each House and the Senate we had to work with for those projects. Now these are projects that were over $50,000 in new construction. That was very clearly defined. So the military had to then start at change. And there's an interesting book written about the Corps of Engineers and their civil works projects. That's a different side. In 1889, the Congress passed the Harbors and Rivers Act of 1889, and they gave to the Corps of Engineers responsibility for maintaining the navigable waterways. And that's been defined several times over the years and changed. The main part of that bill was to develop a water system for the District of Columbia. The nation's capital didn't have a water system.
Well, what do you mean by water system?
Drinking water, the tap water that you turn on. There was not a system in Washington D.C. prior to 1889. Oh, they had wells, they had water, they had wells, but that was a swampy area. And so Congress passed that act, and the it's referred to as the Civil Works, the navigable waterways.
And this was when you were a colonel at the Pentagon.
In the Pentagon.
When did you say the first time you started in the Pentagon was?
Well, the Army Surgeon General's office was in the Forrestal building, which now is Department of Energy. That's on Independence Avenue. And I was the environmental pollution consultant there. And then in '79, I was assigned to the Chief Engineer's office, which was in the Pentagon. And I had another Army assignment in the Army Surgeon General's office, which was also in the Pentagon. That was a different assignment.
I remember you mentioned something about the closest you ever got to being shot at was in the Pentagon?
No. I was. We did have a bathroom, a latrine was bombed in the Pentagon. One of the early sabotage deals was at that time I was assigned in the Pentagon, but not anywhere close to where that bomb went off. My office in the Pentagon, one of my assignments was where when the airplane went into the Pentagon, the office that I occupied for 4 years was right where the nose of that plane went into the D ring. It hit the E ring, the outside ring, and right into the D ring, in the area where my office had been.
Did you still have anybody up in the higher echelons that was still there when the plane went in?
I knew some, but I didn't know anybody that was actually killed. I didn't know them personally. No.
Were you worried about them when the plane went in? Or did you check to make sure?
Well, this was after I was out of the Army.
Yeah.
I was retired and back here in South Carolina by that time.
I was asking, but you knew people that still worked at the Pentagon?
Yes.
And
yes.
Did you, I guess, have to wait till to figure out later if they were okay?
No. The closest was our daughter by this time was working in the patent office in Crystal City, which is about 2 miles from the Pentagon. And of course, when that occurred, there were all kind of rumors, and there was that other plane that went down in Pennsylvania, which allegedly was targeted for other targets in the D.C. area. But she was in the Crystal City. But it was all over by the time I realized that what had happened.
Now, when did you, I guess, first make it back into Washington, but even before you were at the Pentagon? You said you worked at the office. How long were you, what years were you just in Washington?
In 1971, I was in the Army Surgeon General's office, 71 to 74. Then from 74 to 79, I was in the headquarters, Army Materiel Command. Headquarters was in a lease building in Alexandria. And then I had 4 assignments in the Washington area. The next assignment was in the Chief Engineer's office in the Pentagon. And then I was in the Army Surgeon General's office, which was also in the Pentagon. And then we got moved to Bailey's Crossroads to a leased facilities in the D.C. area. I was in the Pentagon when I retired in 1987 from the Army.
And was, when you, getting around to when you finally retired, what were you thinking when you first thought? Did you remember back to how you said you didn't plan on making a career out of it?
Yes, oh yes. Yes, in those days, under the draft system, of course the draft ended in 1972-73 time frame. Under the draft system, depending on the Selective Service Act, when you turn 18, and I turned 18 when I was a freshman here at Clemson and had to register. We did that in Tillman Hall in the registrar's office at that time when I turned 18. You had under the law at that time, I had a 2-year obligation, 2 years active duty, and then 6 years in the reserve, either active or inactive reserve. So that was my military obligation. And once I got assigned to Germany, I had to sign for a 3rd year to be able to take the family over at government expense. And after I was in Germany as a 2nd lieutenant and inspecting the drinking water system in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which was a resort area, recreation area for the military, I decided I wanted to stay in. And the Army sent me back to graduate school at the University of Minnesota.
And that's when you switched from reserves to active?
No, I had to, actually when I went regular Army, in order to go to graduate school, I had to apply for regular Army. And I did that when I was in Germany, in Munich.
What were the events that led to changing your mind to go from reserve to active?
Regular Army? Well, both my wife and I liked it, and we had 1 child at that time, and we talked with some child psychologists about the problems of moving families, particularly children. And conclusion was that the well-adjusted, the normal, whatever that is, and our son at that time was 1.5 to 2 years old, as far as we knew was normal, and it turned out to be okay. There was really little or no impact having to uproot them and move them around. And so we decided we'd stay for 20. And plus the opportunity to go back to graduate school. Fully funded, tuition paid, moved me to, I went to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. I could pick any place I wanted to go. Clemson still did not have an environmental engineering program at that time.
I think we just got accredited within the last 2 years.
Right. They just started a bachelor's program too, but at that time, 1960, when I went to graduate school, there were several. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill had a good program. Johns Hopkins in Baltimore had a great program. Michigan had one. California had one. University of California at Berkeley had a great program. And there were several others in 1960 time, but Minnesota had a super one.
How heavy did the chance that we might go to war weigh on you when you decided whether or not you were going active?
Yeah.
Did you, how big?
Not really, because at that time, and I figured that if the Congress declared war, as they did in World War II, then everybody had a commitment, and I felt an obligation to serve my country, and I would have volunteered. So I really didn't even think about that. You know, what would happen? Well, the closest we came was when we were stationed in Edgewood Arsenal at the Army Chemical Center, but outside of Baltimore. It was during the Cuban Crisis, and if you're familiar at all with that was we came real close to having a confrontation with Russia. We were very close.
I guess, were you more worried then than you were at any time in Germany or Korea?
No, not really. By then, no, not at all. If we go to war, we go to war, and that's, I wasn't concerned. That never entered my mind.
You weren't any bunker list or anything?
No. We did, as a result of our experience in Germany, we had to, for the dependents, a wife, in my case, a wife and one son, should the balloon have gone up, is what we called it, and the Russians attacked, then the dependents had an evacuation route, and we had to keep a half a tank of gas and kept a foot locker with a week's worth of food in it, and we had that foot locker with some sea rations and some other things, flashlights and other supplied quilts and blankets. And when we were stationed at Edgewood, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, their range would have included Baltimore and Washington from Cuba. And there was a lot of talk then about, well, what happens if they shoot those missiles at us? And we said, well, my wife said to her friends, well, don't worry, we got our bug out kit in the basement. And they took us, and we actually did. We still had it. We'd moved from Germany, but with some canned goods and canned water and that kind of supplies. But we had to keep that in Germany in our basement all the time.
Now, I know you were still in active service. A lot of things that people say they always remember is where they were when JFK was shot.
Right.
Do you, where were you stationed at the time?
I was stationed in Edgewood Arsenal in the Army Environmental Hygiene Agency. Again, this is an Army Chemical Center in Edgewood Arsenal, east of Baltimore. And I remember it very well. Somebody called me and said, turn the radio. We had one radio down in the shop area where I was, and we cut the radio on and listened to it. Of course, being there in the Washington area, we went down several times. Not during the funeral, but during those days.
Had you ever seen him personally, or come within any speeches he might have done, or at his inauguration or anything like that?
No, never had any contact with him. And all those years I spent there in the Washington area, I never really had it. And that's one of the beautiful things about this country, and the separation of power with the civilian control. And I firmly believe that's the way it should be. And George Washington could have been king in essence, but he opted not to do that, and ran for president. But the separation, and I was there in Washington during the changes, Democratic Republican changes, and that the person we say down in the trenches, it really has no impact. Now in the upper levels, the secretaries of Army Navy, the services, are appointed by the president, and they turn over. And there are many civilian positions that change, as long as and the chief of staff of the Army, and those will change as new presidents take over. But it's completely apolitical, and I think that's part of the strength of this country, is having it that way. I don't think we'll ever have a military takeover. We won't have a 7 Days in May, if you've ever heard of that book. Or this was a military takeover, a novel written around a military takeover.
Now, you got out in the late 1980s. And
87, that's
87.
correct. Right.
And the Berlin Wall fell about 3 years after that.
That's correct.
Well, where were you when that went on? Were you watching on TV, and did you, I guess, as someone who saw it a lot, what were you thinking when that happened?
Disbelief. I couldn't believe it was happening. And I did watch it. I got glued to the television when that happened. But I was here. I was working at the National Council of Examiners for Engineering and Surveying, which is located here in the Clemson area. And when that happened, it was just, I just can't believe it. I don't believe it's happening. And yet there it was. And to see those pictures of those people with their pitchforks and up on top of it and knocking holes in it, I knew some folks that got pieces of the cinder block in the wall, but as souvenirs. Yes, it was disbelief. After all those years of 30 years by then, I'd been on active duty, and I had 4 years in the reserves before that. Well, of course, the Korean War was going on when I was a student here at Clemson, but during all those years, I never thought that Russia would collapse as it did.
What would you think if tomorrow they said the demilitarized zone was being taken down to Korea?
It would be wonderful. North Korea and South and the Korean continent is similar to the United States in the sense that, as here in the United States at the Civil War time, the industry was in the north and the south was agricultural. And you know that in 1861, it took us a long time before the South really drew industrially well. Same thing in Korea. The industry was in the north, and the South Korea was agricultural. But you see what's happened over there in a relatively short period of time. South Korea has become, just a phenomenal industrial giant. And they had no industry at all at the end of the Korean War, or very little at the end of the Korean War in 1953, or when the truce was agreed to.
Well, just wrapping up, is there anything else, I guess, that really stuck with you with deciding to join the Army? Do you have any regrets? Do you ever wonder what being a civilian that whole time might have been like? Or
No, not really. Not really. I never really looked back. I had worked for one summer after I graduated and before I went to graduate school here at Clemson for J.E. Serene in Greenville, and I had an opportunity to go back there, but after I saw the military side, I decided I liked that. So I never had any regrets.
And how much would you say the Army made you who you are, or would you say you fit the Army?
Well, I'd say it's a mix of both. Certainly the Army has influenced me, and I think that both engineering education and training, and that first year here in the ROTC program molded me, but I'm not sure that I would have been any different. With a strong family that I came from, and an emphasis on education, I think it would have turned out, I could have gone to civilian life and been okay, but my wife kept telling me when we were making that decision to go regular Army and stay in the Army, at that time for 20 years, that was okay with her as long as I'd bring her back to Clemson in 20 years. Well, it took me 30 years to get back here, so.
Well, we here at Clemson are very proud to have you here. I'm very proud to have you as a graduate, and wish you many more years here.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you too.